Okay, so we are both on this incredible project, both advisors, this amazing project called Cannabis and Psychosis. For those of you who want to learn about Kira, even before we get in depth here, she's done an interview on the website, cannabispsychosis.ca, sharing her own experience and why she is participating in this project. Do you mind just telling us a little bit about what Cannabis and Psychosis is all about, exploring the link in this project that we're both a part of?
Yeah, definitely. So the idea with Cannabis and Psychosis is that there's a lot of information out there, and some of it is not from sources that are necessarily trusted by young people. So we want to kind of have a hub of information for young people to go to, with information that they can trust when making decisions about cannabis and their mental health in general, beyond even just psychosis.
The difficult part is that there is a lot of information out there. And if you just Google, okay, can cannabis cause psychosis, or mental health implications when using cannabis, there are so many different sources. And what's happening now is actual cannabis companies are ranking on Google. So maybe you're getting biased information, not the latest research, not the most helpful research. Why is Cannabis and Psychosis what we're doing with youth? Why is it different?
Yeah, that's just a great point. I would say like two main things to that. First, like you just said, if you Google cannabis and psychosis, and you might have a lot of information about how cannabis causes psychosis and how that's a very scary experience for some people, and very much using this language of causality, of saying that you use cannabis and so you develop psychosis. And that really strips the nuance from that whole relationship. But it also means that if that does happen to a young person, they do, let's say, smoke weed and do so a lot, and at some point they have a psychotic episode. After that, there's virtually kind of, no resources for those folks that they would find on those websites that tell them that cannabis use could cause psychosis. So there's this kind of preventative / fear mongering in certain aspects piece to the relationship. But then for folks, once they're already there, once they've already experienced psychosis, there's a lot less. So we try to also make sure that we're providing information and support and resources to people who do smoke cannabis, who have maybe experienced a psychotic episode or continuously experience psychosis or schizophrenia. So that's one piece of information that's not really out there. And then in terms of what cannabis companies are putting out, or different other kind of more anecdotal sources are putting out, there's a lot around mental health as well, right? Like, smoke some weed for your anxiety and it will help you. But the thing is that with anxiety, it's kind of like, you're rolling the dice. It's kind of a 50-50. Some people will benefit from smoking weed or whatever, consuming cannabis in one way or another for their anxiety, but for others, it will really make it worse. And so that's a piece of information that, if you just show the positive aspect, the aspect where people are benefiting from cannabis for their anxiety, the whole other piece of the puzzle, which is that some people are really not benefiting from cannabis for their anxiety and it might be making it worse, you don't hear about that. So with Cannabis and Psychosis, we're trying to really expand these conversations so that we have representation of different experiences, and showing how this really, really complex relationship, we can actually try to make sense of it and see different stories represented.
I think, just the one thing when you said 50-50, it's so true, even if it's anecdotal evidence. You ask people, what's your experience with weed? A lot of them are like, oh, yeah, just like makes anxiety so much worse. Other people, yeah, it calms me down. It's such a individual experience for people. So I think what's great about exploring the link, and which is why I was attracted to helping out this project on the digital side, is that we have professional perspectives from medical doctors and psychiatrists and psychologists and people like you who work in drug policy. But then we also have the perspective of youth and people in the community. And I'm gonna mess up the acronym. So your other job here is working for what organization?
CSSDP, Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy.
Yes.
That's a national organization, and that's where I do a lot of my policy work.
Right. Okay. So when thinking about policy and wanting to have this discussion about cannabis use and psychosis and exploring this link and talking about mental health, is the one reason you joined this project and why it's so awesome? Is it because it's youth led? Because I know that's why I really was attracted to it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. With Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy, we are completely youth-led and run and operated. And you can really see the benefits, both for the youth who are involved with the project, how we develop new skills and networks and opportunities, whether that be like for your career or just for learning new things and feeling empowered and feeling like you can actually make a difference. I mentioned this in my interview on the website, but I think it bears repeating that there's a lot of ways in which the world can be really frustrating, and it can really feel like you don't have control over virtually anything right now. And so having a space in your life and in your work where you do feel like you can make a difference and you are having an impact and you are moving things along, I think is really not to be underestimated, and the positive aspect that can bring to a young person's life. And that's just on the side of getting involved with projects, whether it's CSSDP or whether it's Cannabis and Psychosis. Having young people run the whole show is great for them. And then it's also great for audiences, right? With Cannabis and Psychosis, we've moved a lot from traditional forms of disseminating drug education, which would be like flyers or, like 2-3 page documents, maybe 1 page also. But we're moving towards things like this, right? Things like videos, things like podcasts, platforms that appeal to young people a lot more. And we're hoping that by representing different young people's experiences, we bring more young people into the conversation and showcase their voices above everything.
That's such a massive piece where you actually have that resonance and people can actually relate. It's not always an adult telling you what to do or how to do it. It's someone like on our youth committee, we have people who have experienced psychosis, who have used cannabis before, who actually don't have any interest in trying cannabis, but they know someone who uses. So it's an incredible array of people and with lived experience. It's amazing. Let's talk about harm reduction. Ding, ding, ding.
Yes.
Harm reduction. Can you let the audience know what harm reduction is all about and why that's a core piece of this project and what we're doing?
Definitely. Some people might have differing opinions about how harm reduction started. I usually explain harm reduction kind of in opposition to an abstinence-only approach. I do recognize that abstinence does have a part to play in harm reduction as well. Some people will just abstain from certain substances, and that's valid, and that is a way of reducing harms. But harm reduction kind of evolved as this philosophy that says that telling people to just say no to drugs, or telling people to just completely avoid an activity that's risky. And that can be drug use, but that can also be like driving or just existing in the world. We're taking risks all the time in our lives, in different ways, just by, walking on the street. And we don't stop that, right? Most of us go out into the world, and some of us drive, and some of us do partake in these activities, but we try to reduce our risks as much as possible by wearing a seatbelt, by crossing intersections, probably, hopefully, at the light, and just doing these things that we've established as a society will make our risk of engaging in necessary risky activities less risky. And so the philosophy kind of translates from that into drug use as well. People are going to use drugs. Some of them are going to get mostly benefits from it, whether those are social benefits, whether those are personal kind of health level benefits or personal wellness and mind space benefits. And the idea is to recognize that and recognize that this is an activity that people will want to do. Not everyone, but a lot of people will want to do. Recognize why, and then recognize how to try to steer someone's experience of drug use towards more positive experiences and fewer negative experiences. So that is harm reduction, right? Reducing the negative aspects as much as possible, to just keep people safe and well, and respecting their agency to make decisions about their own body by putting drugs in that body.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that harm reduction. So again, we're not with Exploring the Link. We're not bringing youth to our website and saying, "Hey, listen, weed is terrible. Don't touch the stuff. I know it's legal, but that doesn't mean anything." That's not what we're saying. We're saying, make an informed decision. Here's the information we have at your disposal, everything that's out there from a variety of different perspectives, and then you can now make a more educated decision. What are some of the things that would kind of invite people to think about their use and have this harm reduction mindset? Like, what are some things, if someone's thinking about using cannabis, what are things that, would help them think about, okay, is this kind of the right thing to do for me?
Yeah, absolutely. So if somebody's just hasn't consumed yet or hasn't used weed in any way, but is thinking about it, something that we learned from our previous project, which kind of led into this new project that we're releasing soon with the release of our website, is that some folks who have used cannabis and who have developed psychosis, one thing that they would have liked to say to their younger self is to use because you want to use, not because people are around you are using. And this is something that we can apply to any stage of use, for people who are using and for people who are considering it but not using at the moment, is how to be more mindful with your cannabis use. So for somebody who's thinking about thinking about am I expecting to use in a situation that is safe and that just feels good for me? So for example, teenagers who are using in a park and they're kind of bumming the weed of somebody who got it from this random other guy who sells weed in the park, and it's like already grinded and just like, and they're with people who they might not know. They might have never smoked weed before and they're about to do it in that context. That for me is a concern more than the actual weed use itself. It's just, is the person feeling safe in that environment? Would they have chosen to smoke weed if it weren't because they, had been drinking with their friends in the park that night? And don't get me wrong, sometimes it will be super fun. Sometimes it will just be a bonding experience with your friends. And you'll have a good time, and maybe you'll discover that you like weed more than alcohol, and that can have some payoffs as well. But this context piece, the piece of your environment, the piece of who you're using with, and who's really making the decision. Would you have chosen to do this if your friends weren't? And what are you hoping to get out of the experience is also like a really good question to ask yourself before using any substance. This is something that is practice a lot with psychedelics is like before you use, let's say, mushrooms or acid, is to think, okay, what am I looking to get out of this trip? And you can kind of use those principles with weed as well. And then if you are consuming and, it is part of your, let's say, weekly life, if not daily life, to also ask yourself questions about your use and how comfortable you're at with how you're using. Do you feel like you're using out of habit or out of boredom sometimes? And does that sit well with you? And sometimes, yeah, like I'm bringing up these examples of questions that you might ask yourself to then reduce your use or not use. But as you said, that's not what we're advocating for. We're not advocating for use or for non-use. We're just advocating for, just be mindful and try to ask yourself these questions, and make sure that you're respecting your own agency, respecting your needs, and trying to make it as beneficial of an experience as possible if you are going to use.
Beautifully answered.
Thank you.
What have you learned working with students in this sensible drug policy? Do you get in depth as far as the motives when students are trying cannabis or any kind of drug for the first time? Is it still based around this idea of peer pressure or boredom, as you said? Do you get in depth with these kinds of conversations with students?
Yeah, totally. I think that those would be reflective of different life stages from the conversations that I've had. I also work with a Montreal-based initiative called VoxCan, that's for cannabis education. And in that context, I have a lot of conversations with mostly students and mostly university, college-aged students. And it's interesting because you see that at the adolescent level, yeah, maybe people are using out of peer pressure or out of curiosity. And that's kind of more what's leading people to try. But then when you get to this kind of transition period of folks moving into res, starting university, or just living alone for the first time, it is something that we hear quite frequently, is that people's cannabis use increases at that time. For whatever reason, because people have all this new freedom, so they can smoke weed whenever they want. So maybe they will, or maybe they have less structure. Maybe they don't have other activities that they're doing yet after they're done their day. So they're just smoking a joint because why not? And that's fair. Maybe what we have seen is that people look back on those experiences and look back on that transition and feel that it didn't really bring them that much benefit. It made sense in the moment, but with time, they felt that it hadn't really contributed much to their experience or their life overall. Not everything has to be like this big, huge thing that changes your life, but this is what they reported. Something that we also hear from people in that transition period, but also from younger people, is issues with dosing, just like smoking too much, just getting like way too baked, and then you're just couch locked, or you're just kind of like you can't do anything. So it's not super fun for you either. And then people learning to dose a little bit less so that they can still be like the equivalence of tipsy, but for weed.
Right.
Like,
Yes, not hammered, but tipsy. Yes.
Yeah.
You can still dance if you're tipsy and have a good time and sweat it out the next day. You're feeling good. But yes, if you're hammered, you're the person on the floor and in the bathroom for the party.
Exactly. And like, it's no fun, Yeah.
So with the sensible drug policy, I love how you interact with students, and it was called VoxCan. That's correct?
Yeah.
VoxCan. That's amazing. What about, with making the decision to actually try cannabis? What I love, and you said it as I'm just repeating here, that you have an intention. What am I looking to get out of this trip and this experience. But a lot of the time it's almost like what benefit is this actually going to add, and what is this going to bring into my life? As far as even just one use and multiple uses, like what is this thing? It can be cannabis, it can be anything in your life. What is this adding to my actual life, and how would it feel if I didn't have it? And I think that's one of the questions the youth brought up. Those of, a message to those who are currently using cannabis and maybe think that it might be problematic. That's one question that our youth committee came up with, was you ask yourself, what would my life look like without cannabis, without this substance, without this crutch or this materialistic thing? What else would you say to someone who's currently using cannabis, who might be like, okay, maybe I use cannabis every day, I'm smoking every day, I know it's not the best, this might be a problem. What would you say to a person who's in that situation?
Yeah, well, first I'd say that it's really hard while you're in that situation to really analyze it. And this is kind of reflective of what we've heard from folks, as I was just mentioning with VoxCan, is that a lot can be kind of picked apart in retrospect, but when you're in it, it can be harder to be really critical of how you're using. But something that is brought up by the youth advisors in the Cannabis and Psychosis Project is like when weed starts to replace other things in your life. That can be a flag to look out for. If you are wondering, like, I'm using often, but that alone isn't an indicator of problematic use or use that's getting in the way of your goals, right? Like frequency or dosage alone cannot tell a person that. So you have to ask other questions that are more related to what's the place that weed has in my life versus other things in my life that are also important to me, like my relationships, like my school, like my work, like my other goals, like sports for some people as well. And so something that one person mentioned was I noticed that cannabis was starting to be a problem for me when I was using it when things were good and when things were bad. And I was replacing some of my social activities with just smoking alone. And essentially anything was an excuse to smoke weed.
And it's yes, that's right. It's not only a celebratory thing now once in a while. It's also when things don't go well and that's your go-to. And then it's things when you're stressed and it's your go-to. And I understand. Yeah, that's right. That's great.
But I think it bears mentioning that that's also just a coping strategy for folks, right? Like, it's not because people are doing that it doesn't make total sense. Like we hear a lot that weed is more accessible than therapy or, mental health services. And that's also something that in that transitional period that I was mentioning can really impact your cannabis use, is like the anxiety or the isolation or whatever you might be feeling when you start university or when you're just experiencing a stressful environment. Maybe like weed is the most accessible way for you to give your brain a break from what you're feeling. And maybe, it would be better for you to learn, I don't know, how to meditate or to do more sports or something, like this checklist of like wellness things. But sometimes for a reason or another, that's just not feasible. And so, like people can be using weed as this thing that they depend on for, and not as in cannabis dependency, but just something that they count on to alleviate issues with their mental health. And it is important to note that sometimes that's the only option for them. And so, maybe it's not the best, but also maybe their mental health is not the best, or maybe their situation at the time is not the best. And that's just a response to it.
That's, and just for youth that are coming to exploringthelink.ca, that is a place of especially with everyone on the team and our youth committee, like, it's a place of no judgment, right? It's like, if you're currently using, if you're thinking about it, and know that you're going to use cannabis, there's absolutely no judgment. If you're using it as a coping mechanism, like, we're trying to provide people with all of these perspectives and resources to make them feel like they're not alone, that there's help out there, that there's great evidence-based education out there. And we just want to have this platform in this medium where people can come to and feel safe, right? And feel that they can trust it. One last question for you, the fun one. Legalization. Pro?
That's the question.
Yeah. Are you for or against legalization in Canada?
Absolutely for legalization of cannabis as well as other drugs.
Okay. And in 3 sentences, please explain why. No, you take as long as you want. Why are you pro legalization?
First, I mentioned briefly the idea of agency and kind of respecting people's right to choose and make decisions for their own body. And so that's a huge aspect that is completely discordant of criminalizing people for this decision that impacts most of the time just themselves or their own body. I can see arguments around like healthcare costs or emergency visits. But then again, there is just this parallel to be made between other drugs that we have that are legal, that are more harmful and taxing on our social systems, whether they be health, whether they be legal systems, or different other social support systems. So like alcohol, like tobacco, and that's not to demonize those drugs either, right? I think it's really easy to try to push up weed by pushing down alcohol and tobacco or just other drugs, opioids too, right? That's a whole other discussion though. And so just noticing that people, like human rights, are important to consider in the context of substance use. So that's one reason that legalization is good, to stop criminalizing people for what is often a very personal choice. And a lot of the times especially with criminal records for things like cannabis possession, the criminal record is going to be more detrimental to somebody's life than the cannabis use. Right? Like, and there's this using the strong arm of the law to address things that can be much more easily addressed through education, right? And social connectivity and talking and having these open and honest conversations instead of just trying to push this reality to the side, because it is a reality. We do have high rates compared to other countries of youth cannabis use and just of cannabis use in general. So people are going to use whether it's illegal or not. So might as well provide folks with a safer alternative. And with legalization, I guess now I can kind of use data from after legalization to justify my point, but the demographic where we have seen an increase in use after legalization, because that's another question, is legalization going to make people smoke more weed?
Right.
And what we found is that the age group where use has increased is seniors, who are using more like edibles and more products that are generally for health issues. So that's
that's not that I wouldn't have expected that.
Yeah. And then the age groups that we're kind of more worried about, like 15 to 17-year-olds or youth, especially under 25, there hasn't been an increase in these groups. So
very interesting. Right, because I think what people may have imagined is, okay, once Johnny turns 19, he's going to go and boom, he's legal to now purchase cannabis, and that's like the number one thing to do as people reach that age. Clearly, that's not the case.
And Johnny has had access to cannabis for years now.
Exactly. Yeah, if Johnny was going to do it, Johnny would have done it before. I'm in complete agreement. It's like, are you waiting until you're 19 to get beer from the beer store, or are you buying it from a buddy or your older brother's picking you up a 6-pack? And I love the project because it allows us to have these honest conversations and pick the brains of youth and see, okay, what are you thinking about these things? What do you think about legalization? How has it affected you and your community? And how do your friends use, and what's their perception about legalization and harm reduction, and what's their experience been actually using cannabis? Has it been great for anxiety, bad for anxiety? So it's just like, I think I wouldn't have been part of this project, and I'm sure all of the youth could say the same, and everyone on the team, if we weren't allowed to just have open discussions about this thing. Because I think to start the dialogue and to actually move this forward so people trust the project is being completely open, sharing all experiences, all walks of life, whether it's pro or con, right? It's to have that balanced discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's why we want to have those experiences represented, right? Some people have negative experiences with weed, and some people have positive experiences with weed. And for a lot of people, it's more nuanced than that. And just showing that and just supporting people instead of just trying to get them to fit a certain mold or to go in a certain direction. We just want to provide support.
And on that note, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Kira, for joining the podcast. Everyone, please check out cannabisanpsychosis.ca in French and English, of course, being a Canadian initiative. Cannabisanpsychosis.ca. We're exploring the link between cannabis and psychosis, but also it's a website and platform to talk about all mental health and how cannabis affects our minds and our bodies and our lives in general. So there's lots of video content on there, lots of expert opinions, lots of community perspectives, resources. If you need immediate help and helping a friend or family member, please check it out. And I hope you find it useful and helpful. Thanks so much, Kira.
Thanks, Scott.
All right. Bye-bye.